It was Sherlock of next year. The delegation was back at Earth, September of 1916, as the locals said. They used the same approach they did the first time, however they were intercepted by many more fighters this time. The sight, one of the diplomats would later remark, was like watching primitive hawks, all form as one. However, that hawk could disassemble if it needs to into individual unit. A hive mind of individuality, if you will. The same diplomat also happened to be heading this mission. Within this he held many of his species' top guards and delegates with them. In many ways, it was a symbolic show of the might of the unified systems of the Milky Way. However, on this mission, the diplomats were primarily haddock, a tall, lanky and weak species physically, but known for their political ability. The guards, however, were terrifying in comparison to their diplomatic counterpart. They consisted entirely of Porto Inferno, or what directly translates to bringers of hell. They had large hulking forms, about 12 feet in height, and were proportional in width. Their humanoid body made them look like giant humans except for their rippling muscles. As they touched down, the unpleasant reminder of the human world's constant want to kill was over their heads. The gravity was about 4 times that of the Porto Inferno home world, which was considered to be on the edge of livable. The diplomats struggled to even twitch a finger in their natural body, and thus were wearing power armor to counteract the extreme gravity. As they disembarked, the oxygen in the air began to burn their throats, despite their respirators. Almost every species in the USM came from a sulfur-breathing atmosphere. Oxygen was seen as an archaic medium to breathe, only for primitive species. They came under their sun, a rather dark star. The world was considered to be dark by many species standards. It was theorized, correctly but unknown to them at the time, that humans had quasi-night vision, though that was seen as far-fetched. As the delegation stepped into a large building where they last met, they realized there had been so major changes on this world since they had last been there. Namely, the world, while not united under one banner, would unite to fight global issue in the newly formed Foedus Nationum Pro Humanitatibus Defensio, Latin, as a reactionary measure. The room had 8 large flags, with many smaller ones next to it. The first was the flag of the United States of America. And pod flags even by galactic standards. Next to it was the flag of Italy, then Austria-Hungary, Russian Empire, French, German, then British flag. The diplomats of all nations in the League sat, looking down at the delegation with eyes of hate and condemnation. They had recently learned a rather frightening detail about humans that made this situation even more imposing. Humans were predators. The only sentient species of predators. Despite many species looking as such, they were simply strong as a measure to run, in the same way a bison is. In this moment they realized they were staring the eyes of a civilization of predators, most likely bred in the crucible of war and hardened by the hammer of a death world, sharpened by the necessity to move forward. Many of the diplomats began to rethink their superiors' orders, realizing that they may have caused a world of angry, scared predators to lash out. Greetings, diplomates of this world. We are here to discuss our ultimatum, a diplomat known simply as Rachop simply said while stepping forward. Ah yes, that horseshit ultimatum, the British diplomat simply said, eyes looking on with amusement. Pardon, but we take this as a grave diplomatic insult, Rachop said simply in response, still waiting for a more formal response. We will give you an ultimatum, ambassador, and it will be as simple as yours. Fuck off and do not disturb us till we reach the stars, or die, a man with a deep, low voice. Of all nations, the U.S. ambassador hated the ultimatum the most, seeing it in his history and that of many other nations. This he took it as a great insult to humanity. Rachop was beginning to feel pissed, as the locals would say. A torrent of insults would continue to come, with full support from their governments. Each government humiliated the ambassador. Finally he snapped, looking up before roaring the next most important words in galactic history. Then war it is, you UGGLY fucking bastards. You are all disgraceful to the mere idea of sentient beings. Everyone stood in silence for a moment. If nobody tried to de-escalate the situation, there would officially be war. However, no one said a word. It was at this moment a cruel smile formed on the American ambassador's face. He then pulled out an old-style slug thrower and aimed. The sight of the gun had in small writing Colt M1911 45 ACP. Rachop stood there, believing it could not break his power armor. 3. The American diplomat said as he cocked back the pistol, the many human guards pointing at the alien guards. 2. He set his finger on taking the safety off. 1. He set his finger now on the trigger. Do it, Yukawa, a roar came from the diplomat, however was suddenly cut off. A bullet passing right where his brain was. Now visible was many pieces of his skull and brain on the floor, his forehead completely missing. He dropped to the floor like a rag doll. This would later be known as the shot heard round the galaxy by humans, and for good reasons. In the following seconds the guards were shot and played with, like a child's toy. Many of the guards began to chant "Dance, motherfucker," dance while shooting limbs and occasionally slugging them across their faces with the helmets of the couldn't move. The cruel smiles of the human ambassador only got more noticeable. If they wanted savages, they would get it. At the end of all of this, only one diplomat lived. He was told to send a herald to the galactic community. The diplomat established a video meeting through the console on the ship. As this was happening, explosives were being laid on the ship. Once they were through, the diplomat began speaking. The humans have made their choice, he said. Trying not to sound nervous, they choose war, he said simply. In a very sudden moment, across galactic broadcasts, the diplomat's head were ripped off his head by a human. He then stepped into frame, showing a 6-7 foot height and a tight, now blood-stained officer's uniform. As he stood there, he began to speak, the bleeding head of the diplomat still in his hand, and in the other was the head of the lead guard. We as humanity have decided that act of subjugation is a humiliation, far beyond reason, and do not want to suffer the injustices of those who see themselves as superior. To all those out there who dare land troops on our beautiful land, keep in mind one thing. We are God's chosen, the few under His grace, the few who holds His paradise up, the few who took to His teachings. We are the Lord's servants. If you dare disrupt His paradise, His warriors will assemble and ensure you pose no more threat. In God we trust. He finished off at the end. He dropped the heads in his hands before walking off the ship. The broadcast was still live, watched as the ship was blown to pieces as a sign of complete rejection of anything alien. That was Chapter 2. Leave any criticism you have in the comments. In the next chapter we'll focus more on the war to come instead of the setup.